On the evening of late August, the kind of night that promised calm waters and a slow descent into autumn, a young couple prepared for what was meant to be nothing more than a casual outing. They had borrowed a small cabin cruiser from a friend, something modest but comfortable enough to carry them across the lake while they enjoyed the last warm days of summer. Friends later described them as light-hearted that evening, still in their 20s, full of plans and the type of ease that comes from believing the future is laid out in front of you. They stocked the cooler, brought along a blanket, and waved to neighbors as they pulled away from the dock. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. They weren't seasoned boaters, but they knew the water well enough, and the lake was familiar, more a piece of home than a place of danger. The sun dipped low, painting the water with a reddish reflection that faded into night. Witnesses on the shoreline recalled seeing the boat's running lights cutting across the open lake, steady and purposeful, before turning toward a quieter cove where many couples anchored to watch the stars. To most, it was just another boat among dozens. No one remembered anything unusual. Yet sometime after 10 o'clock, when the shoreline grew dark and the lake became still, something went wrong. The boat was later found drifting with its boom nudging against the reeds, its engine idling in neutral, a low hum that carried across the water until a fisherman, heading in before midnight, noticed the odd sight. He approached, expecting to find someone asleep or intoxicated at the helm, but instead saw no one aboard. He tethered the cruiser and called authorities. When sheriff's deputies boarded, their flashlights revealed a scene that immediately felt off balance. The cooler sat half open with bottles still clinking in melted ice. 2 glasses had been poured, but never emptied. A purse lay on the floor near the small bench seating, its contents spilled as if dropped in a rush. Life jackets were stacked neatly on the side shelf, untouched. The keys were still in the ignition, the motor still running, a steady mechanical reminder that whatever had happened had not been planned. There were no overturned chairs, no obvious signs of a fight or struggle. Just silence, as if time had been interrupted mid-moment. The first thought was drowning. On lakes like this, tragedy was not unheard of. Someone falls in, the other dives after. Both vanish before help can arrive. But deputies noticed the details didn't quite match. If one had slipped, why was there no sign of commotion, no scuff marks or water splashed inside? Why had neither worn a vest when they were right there? And why had the boat not continued forward under power, but instead sat neatly in neutral? It suggested a conscious hand had shifted the gears, but no conscious hands remained. By morning, word spread across the lakeside town. Families gathered at the dock as rescue boats launched, scanning the water with spotlights and dragging sonar equipment through the depths. The couple's relatives arrived, voices breaking as they tried to answer routine questions. When had they last spoken to them? Had they been drinking? Were they in good spirits? Friends insisted it had been an ordinary evening. No reason to expect trouble. Yet the longer the search dragged on with no sign of bodies, the more uneasy everyone became. This wasn't a vast ocean where people could vanish. This was a community lake, bordered by homes and fishing shacks, where accidents should leave traces. The hours stretched into a day, and speculation began to fill the silence left by missing evidence. Some whispered that perhaps they had planned to disappear, leaving the engine running as a distraction. Others said it must have been a crime of passion, one turning on the other, though the lack of blood or struggle made little sense. Fishermen muttered about deep sinkholes beneath the water's surface, places where bodies could be swallowed whole. Still others clung to the simplest explanation, an accident no one had seen. But for investigators walking back across the dock, the scene left a weight they couldn't shake. The glass still filled but untouched, the engine running with no one behind the wheel, the purse spilled mid-motion. It didn't fit cleanly into any box. As night fell again and divers prepared for another sweep, one detail kept repeating in officers' minds. Boats left adrift almost always tell a clear story, an accident, a fight, a mishap. This one told none. And in the days to come, that quiet, drifting cruiser would shift from being a search and rescue scene to something altogether darker, something that suggested the lake itself was holding secrets just beneath the surface. Deputies stepped carefully across the deck of the drifting cruiser, their flashlights sweeping over every corner of the small craft. What they found did not offer clarity, but deepened the sense of something wrong. The two glasses sat side by side on the bench table, each filled but untouched, as though the couple had been interrupted the moment they set them down. The cooler remained open, bottles resting in half-melted ice. The purse, which had spilled across the floor, revealed items that suggested an abrupt halt. A phone, a set of keys to their home, a folded receipt from the gas station where they had stopped earlier that evening. Nothing valuable had been taken, nothing indicated theft, yet nothing made sense either. Investigators studied the cabin, hoping for obvious answers. The life jackets, still neatly stacked, confirmed the couple hadn't been planning a late-night swim. The running lights glowed steadily, powered by an engine that had not stalled but been shifted into neutral. That one small fact haunted detectives. Someone had consciously adjusted the controls. If the pair had fallen into the water by accident, the boat should have continued forward under idle power until it struck something. Instead, it sat anchored only by reeds and shallow current, as though placed intentionally in this position. There were no signs of a violent struggle, no blood, no broken glass, no torn clothing, just an eerie stillness that seemed to reject every theory. The sheriff on scene radioed for divers to begin immediate sweeps. Boats spread out in concentric circles, searchlights bouncing across the black surface of the water. Sonar scanned the depths, marking shadows that later turned out to be nothing more than fallen branches or old fishing debris. Dive teams descended again and again, surfacing with nothing but frustration. On shore, family members clutched blankets around their shoulders, watching the lake that had always been a place of calm suddenly transform into something hostile. Reporters arrived by dawn, cameras trained on the empty cruiser, asking questions no one could answer. Back on the boat, detectives re-examined every inch. They found the ignition key still in place, a phone charger plugged into the console, and shoes neatly left beneath the bench, suggesting at least one of them had kicked them off to relax. They found no alcohol spilled, no evidence of drug use, no weapons hidden below deck. It was in many ways exactly what a couple's casual outing should have looked like, except for the fact that they were gone. The absence of chaos became its own evidence. A blank slate where something sudden had happened but left no mark. Theories began to circulate among the investigators themselves. One suggested they had argued, one stormed off toward the back, slipped, and fell overboard. The other, rushing to help, jumped in without a vest, and both were lost. Another argued that didn't explain the boat in neutral or the lack of splashing heard by fishermen nearby. A deputy pointed out that drowning accidents often left scuff marks on the deck where people scrambled for balance. There were none here. Others began whispering about the possibility of foul play from outside the boat, someone approaching, boarding, and leaving just as quietly. Yet no footprints or foreign fingerprints were obvious at first glance. As day turned to evening, tension thickened. Divers had nothing to show, and the boat continued to mock them with its normalcy. Family members questioned why police weren't treating it as a crime scene. The sheriff assured them every possibility was open, but privately, officers admitted the evidence leaned toward something deliberate. That purse, its contents scattered mid-motion, suggested an interruption, not a planned swim, not a staged disappearance. It was the single detail that refused to be explained away. The boat was eventually towed back to the marina and lifted out of the water for forensic analysis. Investigators dusted surfaces for prints, collected fibers, and photographed every angle. The untouched glasses were sent to the lab, the spilled contents of the purse cataloged. Specialists examined the throttle and gear lever for smudges or foreign oils. If someone had tampered with the boat, it might still be traceable. But the unease among the team deepened when one of the divers reported something strange. While scouring the lake floor near the drift path, he claimed he saw an unusual shadow on the sonar, a shape he couldn't identify before currents distorted it. It was logged for further investigation, but exhaustion forced the search to pause until morning. By nightfall, the boat sat in impound, illuminated by the glow of security lights, while the lake outside grew silent again. In town, residents locked their doors, uneasy that a couple could vanish so cleanly, leaving only a running motor and 2 untouched drinks behind. The unanswered questions multiplied. Why was there no struggle, no clear accident, no trace of where they went? And if it wasn't the lake that claimed them, what else had? That quiet uncertainty settled over the investigation like a shadow, ensuring that whatever the explanation was, it would not be simple. By the second morning, the lake was no longer a place of leisure. It had transformed into a wide, silent stage where the entire community watched, waiting for answers. Rescue teams launched at dawn, their boats lined with spotlights that cut through the mist hanging low over the water. The search expanded far beyond the reeds where the cruiser had drifted, with sonar sweeping deep channels in rocky shelves known only to locals. The hum of engines and the distant shouts of search crews carried across the lake, but beneath it all there was a heavy stillness, as though the water itself was holding something back. Volunteers arrived in clusters, many in their own small fishing boats. Some were neighbors who had grown up swimming in the coves and casting lines from the shore. Others were drawn simply by the unease of knowing two young people could vanish so cleanly. They combed every inlet, calling out names that dissolved into the fog. Families stood at the marina with binoculars, scanning the rippling water as if the couple might somehow reappear, clinging to driftwood or waving from a hidden cove. No such sighting came. The divers faced the most punishing task. Encased in thick suits, they slipped into the lake's cold depths, their headlamps illuminating only narrow tunnels of visibility before fading into darkness. Visibility dropped to nothing within a few feet, and the lake bed offered little comfort. Silt that swallowed anything dropped into it, branches from decades of storms, jagged rock shelves that created blind pockets. They searched systematically, grid by grid, surfacing with numb hands and blank expressions. Time after time, they reported nothing. No bodies, no clothing, no sign at all that the couple had been there. By midday, the search extended to the shoreline. Volunteers walked along the muddy banks, scanning for footprints, torn fabric, or signs of struggle dragged onto land. Dogs were brought in, noses pressed low to the ground, leading handlers along trails that quickly dissolved in the underbrush. At one point, a dog alerted strongly near a set of old pilings, but further inspection revealed nothing more than decayed wood and fish remains. Each flicker of hope collapsed into frustration. The weight of failure pressed harder on everyone involved. Inside the command post set up at the marina, maps of the lake spread across folding tables, red markers circling search zones. Deputies debated which areas needed another pass. The sonar teams argued over strange readings, most of which turned out to be tree stumps or car-sized boulders resting on the bottom. A few anomalies remained unresolved, but resources were stretched and fatigue was beginning to take its toll. For every hour that passed, the likelihood of recovery, or survival, slipped further away. The families, desperate for answers, clung to the railings outside the command post. They asked about the possibility of foul play, about whether someone else could have boarded the boat. Detectives assured them all theories were still open, but their words sounded increasingly thin. The working assumption was still drowning, yet even that explanation began to falter in the face of the lake's silence. Usually, bodies surfaced within days, carried up by gases or shifted by current. Here, nothing. The water seemed determined to withhold. By late afternoon, more volunteers arrived, swelling the shoreline with people who normally spent their summers in leisure, but now found themselves forming human chains, combing through reeds and shallow coves. Some brought food for the searchers, others just stood and watched, unable to look away. The couple's names echoed across the docks, whispered in groups as theories spread. Had they fought? Had someone lured them out? Or had the lake simply claimed them in a way no one could see? Every theory carried weight, but none carried proof. As the sun dipped behind the tree line, spotlights once again lit the water. The glow made the surface appear almost metallic, fractured by the ripples of boats circling endlessly. Divers prepared for another night descent, their oxygen tanks hissing as they sealed their masks. Some deputies confessed quietly to one another that the lake was beginning to feel like a suspect rather than a setting, vast, silent, and capable of hiding anything. It wasn't rational, but after hours of fruitless searching, rationality was slipping. When darkness fully settled, the scene carried an unsettling contradiction. Dozens of boats moved in disciplined lines, lights cutting through the void, while families huddled at the shoreline, unwilling to go home. They were searching for something that should have been there, two people, alive or dead, and yet the water offered no return. Every pass of the sonar, every dive beneath the surface ended with the same report: nothing. The emptiness was louder than any discovery could have been. By midnight, as crews rotated off shift and the lake fell into brief quiet, one reality began to settle across the community. The couple hadn't simply drowned in plain sight. Something else had happened, and if the lake was holding its secrets, then those secrets were deliberate. That thought, unspoken but heavy, carried into the next morning and ensured the investigation would no longer be treated as a simple accident. In the days following the fruitless search, investigators turned their focus away from the water and back toward the lives of the two missing people. What had begun as a desperate effort to find drowning victims slowly shifted into something more probing, something that required peeling back the layers of who they were and what might have been happening before that evening. Friends were interviewed, family members questioned, co-workers pulled aside to recount the most recent details they remembered. Patterns began to emerge, though none fit neatly enough to give anyone confidence. At first, the story was simple. The couple had been together for several years, steady enough to draw envy from others their age. But as deputies asked more questions, cracks in that portrait surfaced. A few friends recalled overhearing arguments about money, about the burden of shared debt, about one partner's spending habits, and the other's frustration with carrying responsibility. The night of the lake outing, they had reportedly bickered at the dock before boarding the boat. It wasn't explosive, not a screaming match, but enough that others nearby had noticed the tension. A witness remembered the woman shaking her head and turning away as her partner loaded the cooler, her expression tight with frustration. Another described the man as curt, muttering under his breath as they shoved off into the twilight. To the sheriff's office, these details opened one possible scenario. Perhaps the outing wasn't entirely carefree. Perhaps tempers simmered, leading to an argument that escalated on the water. In one version of events, one of them slipped, fell overboard during the heated exchange. The other, desperate to save them, dove in without thought, leaving the boat adrift. It was a theory rooted in tragedy rather than malice, and on the surface, it could explain how two people vanished in a matter of minutes. But when investigators laid this version out on the table, it quickly unraveled. If one had fallen, why had no one nearby heard splashing or cries for help? The lake wasn't empty that night. Fishermen had been within earshot, and a few boats anchored in coves. Not a single person reported hearing the sounds of panic. Even more troubling, the condition of the cruiser didn't align with chaos. The spilled purse seemed abrupt but not violent. The glasses remained perfectly upright, filled but undisturbed. The boat had been left in neutral, something that would require presence of mind, not panic. These details, quiet but undeniable, pushed detectives to question the drowning theory. Family members, summoned into interviews, were quick to dismiss the idea that a financial dispute could have led to violence or recklessness. They described the couple as stressed, yes, but not on the verge of collapse. One parent recalled their last phone call, filled with plans for a family gathering. A sibling mentioned they had been planning a weekend trip later that month. None of it fit with the image of two people so consumed by conflict that they would vanish in such a dramatic fashion. Grief clouded their words, but there was conviction in their insistence that what happened on the lake couldn't be reduced to a fight or accident. Forensic specialists, meanwhile, returned to the boat for closer examination. They studied the scratches on the deck, trying to determine whether they were ordinary wear or fresh marks left from something being dragged. They swabbed the throttle, steering wheel, and door handles for prints, hoping to isolate anyone unfamiliar. Nothing immediately stood out. The absence of evidence began to weigh heavier than the presence of it. Every detail suggested an interruption, yet no trace of the interrupter remained. In private, some deputies began to voice their discomfort. The lake had given them nothing. The personal lives of the couple had given them only tension without explosion. And yet, two people were gone without a trace. The neatness of the boat, the silence of the night, the absence of bodies. It was a puzzle that seemed deliberately constructed rather than naturally occurring. If one had fallen in and the other followed, there should have been at least some sign. If an argument had turned violent, the aftermath should have scarred the scene. Instead, the evidence suggested everything had been reset to stillness. as though time had been rewound after something abrupt had taken place. The theory of a tragic fall remained in official reports, offered to the families as a possibility, but among the investigative team, it never settled comfortably. The sheriff himself admitted to colleagues that too much felt wrong. Drownings usually carried a trail, clothes caught on branches, shoes floating to the surface, witnesses recalling strange noises. Here, there was none of that. Only the hum of an engine left running, and two untouched glasses waiting for owners who never returned. As the third day of the search ended with no new discoveries, the frustration grew more pointed. Officers stared at the sonar logs, tracing shapes that always turned out to be natural. Divers came back shaking their heads, their eyes hollow from hours in the cold. Volunteers began to thin out, exhausted from combing the shoreline without results. The families, however, refused to leave. They stayed at the marina into the night, clinging to the faint hope that morning would bring recovery. But with each passing hour, the feeling grew darker. The theory of a simple accident was beginning to collapse under the weight of what it couldn't explain, and investigators were left staring at a mystery that deepened with every unanswered question. In the days after the search yielded nothing, investigators began combing through every statement from people who had been on or near the lake that night. The first real lead came from a fisherman who had been drifting not far from the cove where the cruiser was last seen. He swore he noticed the boat's lights flickering in a way that wasn't normal. "Navigation lights," he said. "Don't just blink like that." To him it looked deliberate, as if someone was signaling for help. He admitted he didn't think much of it in the moment, assuming maybe it was a wiring issue, but in hindsight, the memory nagged at him. Detectives noted the statement carefully. It was vague, but it carried a seed of possibility. Not long after, two campers who had been pitching tents along the northern shoreline came forward with their own unsettling recollection. Around 10:30, as they were unpacking their gear, they claimed to have heard a scream. A woman's voice, sharp and desperate, carried across the water before being cut off suddenly. They couldn't be certain it came from the cruiser, but the timing placed it in the same window when the couple disappeared. Investigators pressed them for details. How long did it last? Did it sound like panic or play? The campers insisted it was no ordinary call. It was fear, short and final, and then nothing but the lapping of waves. The problem was that none of these accounts matched perfectly. The fisherman had seen the flickering lights closer to 9:30. The campers placed the scream nearly an hour later. Other boaters reported nothing unusual at all. The timeline, instead of narrowing, began to stretch and blur, leaving room for doubt. Detectives tried to piece it together on a board at the command post, but the gaps were larger than the evidence itself. Was the fisherman mistaken about the time? Had the scream come from a different source entirely? Each new testimony only added weight without direction. As uncertainty grew, so did speculation among the townspeople. By the fifth day, the marina had turned into a gathering point for gossip. Some swore the couple had been having an affair with others and had run off together, leaving the boat adrift as a dramatic gesture. Others leaned into darker theories, that someone had followed them onto the lake, maybe another boater who killed the engine, boarded quietly, and left them in the water. That idea spread quickly, feeding fears that the lake wasn't just concealing an accident, but a crime. One older resident told deputies about a story from decades earlier of another boat found drifting with no one aboard. The details were hazy, but the rumor gained traction. Soon, locals were repeating it as fact. The lake had always been cursed. People had been vanishing here for years. Detectives bristled at the talk but couldn't ignore its impact. Witnesses began framing their own memories through the lens of those rumors, convinced they had seen or heard more than they actually had. The investigation became clouded, less about verifiable evidence and more about whispers passed from neighbor to neighbor. Reporters, hungry for headlines, fanned the flames further. Newspapers ran quotes about the scream, framing it as a chilling detail. Talk radio hosts speculated about cult activity, about smugglers using the lake to hide crimes. Each theory seemed more dramatic than the last, and each pulled attention further from the facts at hand. Detectives tried to ground their work, focusing on sonar sweeps and forensic analysis of the boat, but public opinion was drifting faster than the investigation itself. For the families, the rumors cut deeper than any silence. They stood by their conviction that the couple had not staged a disappearance. They begged the public to stop spreading stories and let investigators work. But when reporters asked them directly about the scream, about the flickering lights, they had no answer. Grief mixed with helplessness, leaving them as much in the dark as anyone else. By the end of that week, the sheriff called a press briefing to address the speculation. Standing at the marina, he carefully stated that while witness statements had been logged, no definitive connection had been made between the accounts and the disappearance. He reminded the public that until evidence surfaced, every theory remained just that, a theory. But his attempt at reassurance did little. The more he stressed uncertainty, the more convinced the town became that something was being hidden. Among the deputies, a quieter worry took hold. If the scream had been real, if the lights had been a signal, then they had missed their chance to respond. Hours had passed before anyone noticed the cruiser drifting. Whatever happened had played out in that window, beyond their reach. The realization added a layer of guilt to the frustration. As night fell on the seventh day, boats remained on the water, lights still sweeping, divers still descending. But the investigation was no longer driven solely by search patterns and sonar. It was being steered by stories, fragments of memory, rumors that carried their own weight, and the gnawing possibility that the truth would never be as clear as anyone wanted. And with every new story, the mystery of what happened on that lake only grew deeper. On the eighth day, when most believed the search was destined to collapse under exhaustion, sonar picked up something that pulled everyone back into focus. The discovery came just before noon, as a team swept over the original drift path of the cruiser one more time. The screen showed a shape too solid and too squared off to be natural. It wasn't a body, at least not in the way divers expected, but it was clearly out of place, wedged in the soft floor of the lake. At first glance it could have been debris, perhaps part of a dock torn away in a storm, but the longer the technicians studied it, the more deliberate it looked. The call went out for divers to investigate. Descending through the cold water, divers followed the tether line down to the marked spot. The silt clouded instantly beneath their fins, limiting vision to just a few feet. As their lights cut through the murk, the outline emerged. It wasn't wood or stone, but corroded metal, edges squared, surfaces pitted with decades of rust. A chest, large, heavy, and unnaturally out of place. Chains wrapped around it in multiple loops, the links crusted over, locked tight with what appeared to be an old padlock. The divers marked the site, photographed it through the haze, and prepared to raise it. It took the coordinated strength of several team members and lift bags filled with air to pry the object loose from the silt. When it finally broke free, a plume of mud billowed upward, swallowing everything in darkness for several seconds. Slowly, the heavy chest rose toward the surface, hauled into daylight for the first time in what could have been half a century. Crowds had gathered on shore, watching with uneasy anticipation as the crane arm lowered it onto the dock. The sound of metal scraping against wood echoed sharply, cutting through the murmurs of onlookers. Everyone expected, or feared, that this would be the moment the missing couple was found. When the chains were cut away and the padlock snapped, investigators braced themselves. But inside was not what anyone had been searching for. Instead of bodies, the chest held belongings, old, waterlogged, but unmistakably personal. A woman's dress faded and eaten away by mildew, a pair of leather shoes, a stack of photographs so warped they stuck together when lifted, showing faces long unrecognizable. Jewelry pieces, dull and green with corrosion, scattered along the bottom. The items were not new, not from this missing couple. They belonged to another time entirely. The mood shifted from relief to dread in a matter of seconds. Detectives sorted through the chest carefully, laying each item out on tarps, cataloging what could be preserved. Among the warped photographs was one that showed a young woman smiling on what looked like a pier, her hand resting on the railing of a boat. The image was too damaged to identify her, but the suggestion was chilling. These items had belonged to someone else who had vanished, someone whose story had been swallowed by the lake decades before. The discovery opened a floodgate of speculation. Locals quickly remembered whispers of other disappearances tied to the lake. A teenager gone missing in the 70s, a couple whose rowboat was found capsized in the 80s, A man never recovered after falling from his fishing skiff in the early 90s. Each case had faded into local lore, explained away as accidents. But the chest seemed to argue otherwise. If someone had intentionally chained and sunk belongings, what else might the lake be hiding? The sheriff's office called in historical records, combing through old missing persons cases. They tried to cross-reference the recovered items with unsolved files, hoping for a match. But deterioration made it difficult. Serial numbers had long corroded off jewelry, fabric disintegrated at the edges, and the photographs gave only ghost-like impressions. Forensic analysts promised to run whatever tests were possible, but no one could promise answers. Families of long-missing residents arrived at the scene, desperate to know if the chest tied back to their loved ones. One elderly woman claimed the shoes resembled a pair her sister had worn before vanishing in 1974. Another swore the dress looked familiar. Detectives noted their statements but urged caution. The line between recognition and hope blurred easily in grief. Meanwhile, attention shifted back to the couple who had disappeared just a week earlier. If the chest was unrelated, then it was merely a cruel distraction, evidence of a different tragedy that had been hidden for decades. But if it was connected, it suggested something larger, a pattern, maybe even a predator using the lake for concealment. Detectives leaned toward the latter. They couldn't dismiss the possibility that the chest had been sunk in the same drift path for a reason. That night, news spread rapidly through the town. Television anchors reported not just on the missing couple, but on the lake's buried secrets. Rumors reignited with greater intensity, suggesting the area had long been a dumping ground for bodies or evidence. The sheriff admitted publicly that the discovery complicated the investigation, but he stopped short of drawing a direct line. Still, in private, deputies admitted the timing felt deliberate. Why else would the chest surface now, in the very area being scoured for the couple? As investigators prepared to expand their search grid even wider, one realization pressed heavily on everyone involved. The lake was no longer just a place of possibility. It was now an archive of the unknown, capable of holding stories long past their time. And if a rusted chest could sit buried for decades without notice, there was no telling what else rested beneath the surface, still waiting to be found. When investigators widened their scope beyond the couple, they began to realize the lake's history was not as clean as many had assumed. Old police files, yellowed with age, documented other vanishings stretching back 3 decades. The stories carried unsettling similarities: boats discovered drifting without their passengers, possessions left behind as though time had stopped mid-motion, and no trace of the people who had launched them. Each case had been closed with a shrug of inevitability, labeled as an accident or drowning, but the repetition was difficult to ignore now. One file from 1974 described a teenage girl who had borrowed her uncle's rowboat on a summer evening. The boat was recovered the next morning, tied loosely to reeds on the far shore, but the girl was never seen again. Her sandals had been placed neatly on the seat, her purse tucked against the side. No one could explain how or why she would have stepped out into the water alone. Another case in the mid-1980s involved a pair of brothers who went night fishing. Their boat was found circling slowly in neutral, tackle boxes still open, lantern glowing. Divers searched for a week without finding a single sign of them. In the early 90s, a middle-aged man disappeared while heading out for his routine fishing trip. His boat washed ashore intact, cooler still packed, rods still stowed. Each story, strange in its own right, now sounded disturbingly familiar. Families of those long gone still lived around the lake, and as news of the chest spread, they emerged with fresh grief. One woman recalled her father's disappearance in 1987, remembering how neighbors whispered about how the boat had come back, but he had not. Another family described the humiliation of being told their son had simply drowned, even though no body was ever recovered. For them, the missing couple's case reopened wounds that had never truly closed. They believed the discovery of the chest proved their loved ones hadn't simply vanished into accidents, something else had been at work. In town, whispers turned into stories. Coffee shops, church gatherings, and bar counters echoed with the same refrain. The lake had always been cursed. People pointed to native folklore, to unsolved tragedies, to strange sounds heard at night. Parents told children not to swim too far, not to wander near the coves where boats had been found. The idea of a curse carried more weight than official explanations, if only because it filled the gap left by decades of unanswered questions. Detectives, however, refused to indulge the language of superstition. They leaned into rational explanations, searching for patterns rooted in human behavior rather than myth. They mapped the locations of each disappearance, noting currents, drop-offs, and underwater hazards. They considered whether alcohol or inexperience could have contributed to accidents, or whether the lake's depth and structure explained why bodies failed to resurface. They even investigated the possibility of an opportunistic criminal exploiting the isolation of the water to cover tracks. The evidence never fit neatly, but it provided at least a framework grounded in reality. Yet the weight of so many eerily similar stories pressed heavily on the case. Detectives could not ignore how easily people believed in something larger, something beyond the reach of procedure. The missing couple's boat now seemed less like an isolated tragedy and more like another entry in a long, grim pattern. And while officials insisted on reason, every unanswered question only gave more power to the whispers spreading across the town. When the cruiser was finally hauled from impound and taken to a secure facility for deeper forensic work, investigators hoped that beneath the surface-level strangeness, they would find something concrete. The boat had already been combed during the first frantic hours of the search, but now, with time to slow down and the growing suspicion that this was no ordinary accident, specialists began to look closer. Almost immediately, they noticed things that didn't line up with the weather reports or the expected wear of a vessel used for casual outings. Inside the small cabin, dampness clung to the upholstery. Pools of water had collected in corners where the flooring met the bulkhead. At first, it seemed easy to dismiss as seepage, the kind of thing that happens when a boat drifts overnight. But samples were taken, and when tested, the water contained an unusually high level of silt, more than what would normally splash in from waves or spray. One specialist suggested it looked as though the cabin had been partially submerged or deliberately hosed out, yet there had been no storms that night, no sudden squalls capable of flooding the interior. To detectives, it was the first tangible clue that something had been done to the boat after the couple vanished. Then came the scratches. Along the starboard deck, investigators found a series of long, parallel marks etched into the fiberglass. They weren't gouges from casual bumping against a dock, nor were they consistent with fishing gear scraping across the side. They were deliberate-looking, straight, almost symmetrical. Forensics noted traces of rust embedded in some of the scratches, suggesting contact with metal. It gave rise to an unsettling picture. Something heavy had been dragged along the deck, or perhaps pulled up from the water's surface and hauled aboard. The implications split the team. Some detectives leaned into the theory of foul play. Maybe another boat had approached, someone boarding in the dark, forcing the couple off the cruiser and into the water, then scrubbing or flooding the cabin to remove traces. The scratches could have come from chains or equipment used to secure something during the act. Others resisted jumping to conclusions. They wondered if the answer could be mechanical rather than criminal. The lake was dotted with old pilings and hidden debris. Perhaps the boat had drifted against something sharp, the water forced inside during a partial submersion against the reeds. In that version, the anomalies were strange but explainable without invoking an assailant. Still, the clean nature of the scene troubled everyone. If it had been mechanical, why hadn't the motor stalled? Why had the gear been neatly shifted into neutral? Why hadn't debris been caught in the propeller? Each piece of evidence contradicted the others, leaving the picture fractured. The boat looked both staged and natural at once, as though someone had tried to present the appearance of an accident but hadn't accounted for every detail. The discovery of silt-heavy water in the cabin only deepened the divide. Detectives imagined one grim scenario. The couple forced into the cabin at some point, the space flooded intentionally to destroy evidence of a struggle, then drained again before the boat was left to drift. It was a dark possibility, one that suggested planning and control. Others dismissed it as overreach, pointing out that such a maneuver would have been difficult to execute unnoticed. Yet, no one could fully explain how the cabin had come to contain that much silt, if not through tampering. The scratches along the deck, too, resisted easy answers. Specialists ran models, comparing them to known patterns from ropes, chains, and docking equipment. Nothing matched perfectly. The theory that something had been dragged, possibly even a body, hovered uncomfortably, unproven but impossible to ignore. The sheer weight of that suggestion, that someone could have been hauled across the deck against their will, left even the most seasoned investigators uneasy. As the forensic report circulated, the sheriff held a closed-door meeting with his team. They debated for hours, voices raised, frustration mounting. One side pressed to classify the case as suspicious, to move forward under the assumption of homicide. The other urged caution, warning that without bodies, without witnesses, without direct evidence, they risked chasing ghosts. The room ended in silence, a stalemate that mirrored the very nature of the investigation. Divided, uncertain, haunted by possibilities. Meanwhile, news of the anomalies leaked into the town through quiet channels. Volunteers who had helped in the search spoke to neighbors, who spoke to reporters. Soon, stories spread of the boat being washed down, of claw-like marks found on its surface. The official narrative of a tragic accident began to collapse under the weight of rumor once again. Some whispered that the couple had been murdered, their killers erasing every trace. Others, more superstitious, said the lake itself had pulled them down, dragging them against the boat before taking them for good. Rational or not, the whispers thrived because the facts left too much space to fill. The families, already broken by grief, clung to the new information as proof their loved ones hadn't simply drowned. They begged detectives to treat the case as criminal, not accidental, their voices carrying both anger and desperation. Each anomaly became fuel for their argument. The silt in the cabin, the scratches on the deck, the untouched glasses, the purse scattered mid-motion. To them, these weren't accidents of nature. They were signatures of interference. Late one night, a deputy who had been part of the dive teams admitted quietly to a colleague that he couldn't stop thinking about the scratches. They haunted him, not because they proved anything, but because they seemed too deliberate to ignore. He imagined the couple being pulled, resisting, something heavy grinding against the fiberglass as it happened. It wasn't a conclusion he could defend, but it was an image he couldn't shake. By the end of that week, the official file on the case listed two competing explanations, one rooted in crime, the other in accident. Neither satisfied the growing sense of unease. What investigators did agree on was simple. The boat itself had become the loudest witness, and what it whispered in its marks, its dampness, and its eerie neatness was not a story of peace, but of disruption. Whether that disruption came from human hands or from something hidden within the lake's depths remained the question no one could answer. By the time the investigation entered its second week, fatigue was beginning to set in. Divers had swept miles of the lake in grid patterns, their reports blurring into repetition, silt, branches, stones, nothing. Sonar had logged hundreds of suspicious shapes, nearly all of which turned out to be natural formations. The hope of recovery, even of closure, began to dwindle. But late one afternoon, as the last passes of sonar were being conducted closer to shore, a technician paused over his monitor. Beneath the very dock where the couple had launched their cruise, something odd appeared. It wasn't the irregular shifting silhouette of driftwood or rock. It was dense, compact, and seemed to have weight. It was also in a place no one expected, directly under the structure that dozens of searchers had stood on day after day. The decision was made quickly. A team would dive the site at first light. When morning broke, divers eased themselves into the water near the dock, descending into a world far different from the open channels they had searched before. Here, weeds clung to every post, swaying like ropes in the current. Old timbers from previous rebuilds lay collapsed on the lakebed, forming a tangled maze of debris. The silt was thicker than anywhere else, stirred up into a black cloud at the slightest touch. Visibility dropped to inches. Every movement required patience, deliberate and slow. The divers followed the sonar markers into the tangle. Their lights caught the pale gleam of something fabric-like caught beneath a fallen beam. At first, it seemed like trash, perhaps a tarp or discarded sail. But as they brushed the weeds away, the shape solidified into something human. A second shape was pressed tightly against it. What they had found was not debris at all. It was the couple. The bodies were entangled beneath the timbers, side by side, their limbs caught as though deliberately pressed together. The way they were pinned gave the appearance of being arranged, not merely trapped by accident. Their clothing, though waterlogged and frayed, showed little sign of violent tearing. Their faces, pale and bloated from days submerged, were eerily still. For the divers, the discovery was both relief and horror. Relief that after days of nothing they had finally found them. Horror at the way they lay, positioned not in the chaos of drowning, but in the intimacy of something staged. When the remains were lifted carefully to the surface, the crowd at the dock fell into silence. Families wept openly, clutching one another as the stretchers were carried past. For detectives, however, the scene was less about grief and more about questions. How had two people, both young and healthy, ended up wedged together beneath debris directly below the very dock they launched from? If they had fallen in accidentally, why had the boat been found drifting miles away? And if someone had placed them there, how had they done so without being noticed by the many who lived along the shore? Forensic teams examined the bodies immediately. Both showed signs of drowning, fluid in the lungs confirming water as the cause of death. But there were subtler details that resisted easy explanation. Small abrasions were found on their arms and shoulders as though they had been held or dragged. A faint bruise ringed the woman's wrist, consistent with restraint. The man's shirt bore a long tear across the back, though the edges suggested it had come from pressure against wood or metal rather than a blade. These weren't the catastrophic injuries of a fight or fall, but they were marks of interference, of being forced or pinned. The location itself troubled investigators even more than the bodies. Beneath the dock, amid weeds and collapsed timbers, was a cavity where currents rarely reached. To the divers, it seemed like a natural trap, a place where anything that entered would stay hidden. Yet the odds of both bodies drifting independently into that same spot and ending up pressed together were astronomically small. One diver admitted privately that it looked deliberate, as though someone had used the weight of the timbers to keep them there. Detectives began to reconstruct possibilities. One theory suggested they never left the dock alive, that something had happened before they pushed off, and the boat was later set adrift to mislead searchers. Another theory posited that after being forced overboard, their bodies had been moved and hidden beneath the dock later, though the logistics seemed almost impossible without drawing attention. Either version implied planning, not chance. The discovery shook the town. For many, it confirmed the whispers of foul play. The couple hadn't simply drowned, they had been silenced and hidden. Yet no one could point to who might have done it, or why. Families and neighbors struggled with the contradiction of relief and devastation, relief that the couple had been found, devastation at the way they had been left. The recovery provided answers to the question of where, but none to the question of how. The sheriff's office held a press conference that evening. Standing grimly at the marina, the sheriff confirmed the recovery and acknowledged the troubling details. He promised a full forensic investigation, but stopped short of calling it homicide. His cautious words, meant to temper speculation, instead fueled it. Reporters seized on the imagery of two bodies hidden beneath the very dock they had launched from. Headlines spoke of a sinister staging, of questions that would not go away. In homes along the shore, residents locked their doors tighter that night, staring at the lake with suspicion. The idea that the couple had been lying all along, just feet beneath where the search had begun, unsettled everyone. Theories multiplied. Some were convinced someone local had orchestrated it, someone who knew the lake intimately. Others whispered about the possibility of a pattern, tying it back to the chest and the earlier disappearances. For the detectives, the grim recovery was both progress and paralysis. They had bodies to study, but the way those bodies had been found only widened the mystery. The lake had given them back what they sought, but it had done so with a cruel twist, forcing them to confront the possibility that someone had not just killed, but staged the scene in a place designed to torment. And as they filed their reports that night, one thought echoed among them. The lake had never been the grave itself. It had been the hiding place. The recovery of the couple should have marked the end of the search, but what followed only deepened the sense of unease. As divers cleared more of the debris beneath the dock, preparing to secure the area where the bodies had been found, they noticed something strange. The tangle of fallen timbers and weeds didn't appear entirely natural. Some of the beams had been stacked at deliberate angles, forming a crude enclosure that left a hollow cavity inside. When they examined it more closely, the truth emerged. Someone had shaped the lake bed into a hidden space, an underwater chamber pressed against the dock's pilings. It wasn't a professional structure, nothing with tools or blueprints behind it, but it bore unmistakable signs of human tampering. Nails, long rusted, still clung to portions of wood wedged into place. Sections of fencing wire, wrapped tightly around beams, held the shape together. Over time, weeds and algae had grown across it, disguising the construction as nothing more than collapsed dock remains. But beneath the layers, it was intentional. It was a hiding place. Divers reported the discovery with disbelief. In their experience, the lake bed rarely offered anything beyond natural obstacles, never something designed. The chamber wasn't large, but it was enough to conceal two bodies pressed side by side, enough to ensure they wouldn't drift away, wouldn't surface where searchers could find them, enough to buy time. When investigators heard the report, the weight of what it meant settled quickly. This wasn't an accident of debris, nor was it chance that the couple had ended up where they did. Someone had prepared this spot, long before that night, as though anticipating the need for a holding space beneath the water. The implication was chilling. It wasn't just murder, it was premeditation. Forensic teams photographed the chamber extensively before dismantling it piece by piece. They collected fragments of wood, sections of wire, even the corroded nails. Each was bagged and logged, but none offered identifying marks. Age had stripped away anything that could point to a specific owner. Even the tools that might have shaped it left no traceable signatures. It was evidence of intent without evidence of identity. News of the discovery spread quickly. Within hours, the town that had been whispering about curses now whispered about something worse. A person, maybe still living among them, who had built a trap beneath the dock and used it to hide bodies. Families who had lost loved ones years before came forward again, asking whether this chamber could explain their disappearances. Was this a dumping ground used more than once? Had others been hidden and later moved? Investigators could only answer with uncertainty. The sheriff called another press briefing, his voice tight as he confirmed the find. He acknowledged the possibility of tampering, but stopped short of labeling it a crime scene designed for homicide. He insisted the investigation was ongoing. But the guarded words rang hollow against the weight of what everyone already knew. This was no accident. The structure beneath the dock proved someone had interfered, someone had planned, and someone had used the lake to conceal their actions. In the weeks that followed, detectives pursued every possible lead. They interviewed carpenters, questioned dock workers, and revisited every missing persons case tied to the lake. They scoured purchase records for wire and lumber, looked for anyone with knowledge of underwater construction. Nothing materialized. The chamber was too old, too weathered, its origins lost in years of erosion. Whoever had built it had either vanished or blended back into the fabric of the town, leaving no clear trail behind. For the families, the revelation was devastating. They finally had answers about where the couple had been, but none about who had placed them there or why. Closure remained elusive, replaced instead by a deeper fear that someone had orchestrated the deaths with chilling precision and walked away untouched. The lake was no longer seen as cursed by chance, it was haunted by human intent. By the time the case was formally closed, its ending felt more like a door slammed shut than one carefully resolved. The couple's names were added to the list of those lost to the lake, their story etched into the community's memory. The underwater chamber was dismantled, but its existence lingered as a symbol of unanswered questions. Residents avoided the dock at night, parents kept children from the shoreline, and the lake's once calm reputation was permanently fractured. In the end, the case gave clarity only to the where. The who and the why dissolved into silence, swallowed by the same water that had hidden the truth for so long. And for the people who lived in the shadow of that lake, the knowledge that someone had built a chamber beneath their feet left them with a haunting certainty. The darkest parts of the mystery were not in the depths of the water, but in the hands of whoever had prepared it.